So my talk is going to be on cognitive science as a kind of source of design principles for interactive machine learning. And I think a lot of the things that are going to come up in my talk were kind of mentioned in the introduction. So yeah, I think what's kind of exciting about this workshop is really, as you said, it's kind of bringing together kind of two broad classes of disciplines. So one is kind of things like psychology and neuroscience and cognitive science, and the other is machine learning and robotics. And these are kind of disciplines that deal both with intelligence and social intelligence, but kind of from different perspectives. On the one hand, kind of explaining it in humans, and the other hand, kind of engineering new systems that have similar capacities. And I actually want to kind of draw a analogy with another kind of built system out there for thinking about perhaps how cognitive science can be integrated into thinking about designing systems and social systems, and that's something that maybe we're all familiar with, and that's the idea of doors. So doors, kind of give us hints about how to interact with them. So, for example, if you saw this door, you might think, well, oh, I should probably push this door to open it. So this is a push door. Whereas if you saw, this door, you might think, oh, well, this is obviously a door that I should pull. So this is a pull door. But then, of course, we have doors that are kind of confusing, that kind of send us mixed messages, telling us to both push and pull them in a certain way. This is technically a push door, but it kind of indicates that it should be pulled in a way. And this idea of kind of doors that signal or have certain kind of expected types of interactions, and in particular ones that are bad at signaling what their interactions are actually called Norman doors, and they're called that because they're kind of explored by this, by this cognitive scientist and designer Don Norman, to describe kind of designing systems, designing like everyday objects that may or may not have good kind of affordances, as he calls them. And so these types of doors that kind of indicate both pushing and pulling simultaneously, these can be thought of as having bad affordances. Bad affordances can have very big consequences. There was actually a fire in 1903 where, because of the design of the doors, several hundred people died because they couldn't actually figure out how to open the exit doors. And so, as we're designing systems that are going to interact with people and kind of be part of everyday life, even things as simple as doors, can have consequences. And so, now there are actually laws for kind of designing doors, fire exit doors, as a result of these kinds of tragedies. And so, even thinking about, designing things that have certain affordances, there are a lot of things to think about, things like control panels, cell phones, doors, cars, and faucets, and so on. And these are all dumb things. These are not going to be smart things that kind of interact with humans and have to engage in need some kind of human social intelligence. And so I kind of see cognitive science as playing an important role in kind of giving us kind of design principles for thinking about not just everyday objects, everyday tools, but actually everyday agents, everyday robots. And so if you think of, what makes a good door have good affordances is kind of principles surrounding kind of how people think about kind of intuitive physics and how to plan and act in the physical world. We can kind of think of cognitive science as providing a kind of way of a set of kind of general ideas and frameworks for thinking about how to design systems that are going to interact with us socially and also have good affordances. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is some somewhat old work, kind of thinking about how theory of mind works in the context of communication. And so theory of mind and kind of action and interpretation works in the context of communication. And so I'm going to play this video of a mime, and I want you to kind of watch it and think about, okay, what is this person showing us? Okay, so at this point, it should be relatively clear that this person is kind of conveying to us, the observer, the idea that they're driving, that maybe going along, maybe they're trying to avoid other cars, maybe they're mad at other people, and so on. And what's interesting about this type of video is that we can watch this as humans. We can watch this and there's no actual like stimulus of a car in this. It's just a person kind of waving their arms around in a particular way, and conveying to us this kind of rich world of driving on a highway, maybe potentially crashing into things, and so on. And we can contrast this with what it's like to actually drive. So actually driving looks very different. Actually driving looks more like this, where you're kind of driving along, your hands are on the steering wheel, and so on, and you're not kind of doing the kind of exaggerated motions that you do in the case of kind of miming driving. It's very different, but they're obviously very connected. And so, in some of the work we've done, we were interested in this idea of understanding this kind of phenomenon of communicative demonstrations in human interactions. And communicative demonstrations are interesting because they're kind of a case study in communication in the absence of a conventional system of signaling and communication, like in the case of when people speak the same language, for example. So if we're communicating in the same language, then there's a kind of a lot of already built up common ground that we can rely on to communicate. But in situations where we only are kind of communicating through our actions, we have to figure out, okay, how are we going to communicate? And it's interesting from a both kind of developmental perspective, because obviously infants don't start out being able to speak a language, and also from a comparative perspective, thinking about, okay, what is it that humans have? What kind of inferential and planning processes do people have that allows them to do this that perhaps other animals don't have? So we wanted to study this in a experimental setting with humans. And so we designed this very simple grid world paradigm where people controlled the blue dot on the left and they were trying to get to the yellow goal on the right. And on every trial, these middle colors would change in value. They could either be negative or 0. And so, for example, on this trial, the orange colored tiles are negative. You lose points if you step on them, whereas the purple and the blue are neutral. You don't lose points if you step on them. And we put people into two conditions, either a doing condition, where we told people just the underlying reward function. We told them that the safe colors are purple and blue in this case. And people would do things like this. They'd go down and around to get to the goal, avoiding the orange. And we can represent it like this. In the showing condition, we also told people the reward function, in this case, that purple and blue were the safe colors. But we also told them that your partner, we were going to show their behavior to another participant, and that their partner would need to do another task that involved these colors, but not necessarily in this configuration. And in this case, people would tend to do things like this, where they would go down and around to avoid the orange, but they would also be sure to kind of cross both the purple and the blue, which we can represent like this. And so, these are two kind of slightly different trajectories that you could take on this same maze, depending on if you're simply doing the task versus communicating the task to another person. And if we plot out what all the people on this experiment and between these two conditions did, we can see that there's like a pretty substantial difference in the type of behavior that people are doing. They're just doing a task versus conveying a task. And so we can ask, okay, what's happening on the right-hand side that's different from the left-hand side? And another thing is that in this showing condition, people would do pretty interesting, wacky things. So for example, this person kind of went down and around. This person kind of cycled around and around. This person kind of picked specific locations to scrub back and forth on. And we can ask, from a computational perspective, how is it that people, what's going on between this doing type of action and the showing type of action? Something's happening in this showing action that is kind of more social, more interactive. And so, the way we can think about this is as a kind of planning and theory of mind and inference process. So on the one hand, you could have a very simple agent that's just doing the task, where they have a model of the task, of the reward function and so on. And based on that model, they do some planning and then they take some actions. And you could also have an observer who's kind of watching the actions taken by this agent, and then based on those actions, inferring through a planning process what the model that the decision maker originally had was. And so this is a fairly standard, just inverse planning kind of formulation of theory of mind. And the key thing is that you kind of have this generative planning process and then inference on the other side. And so we can think of this kind of communicative version of acting, communicative demonstrations, as being the result of perhaps a more complicated form of planning of a more complicated model, specifically one that involves both the underlying true physical world of the grid world, and then also a model of the observer and the types of inferences that they're going to make based on your actions, and then doing planning over this kind of joint model of inference and task. And this kind of general idea that we can formulate and think about theory of mind not only as a kind of process of doing inference, but actually as a kind of model that is used for planning, I think is a very powerful one, and that we explored a bunch in this review paper on kind of planning with theory of mind and how that could potentially be distinct from more purely statistical alternatives that don't do model-based planning, things like model-free reinforcement learning or just learning a statistical model of another agent's behaviors. And so the reason why I wanted to start out with that stuff is just to kind of highlight that, there's this kind of rich human social intelligence and interactions are really difficult to study without also considering kind of broader aspects of human general intelligence. And so this diagram from this classic paper from Tomasello and colleagues shows, two agents forming a shared goal, engaging in decision making, and then each kind of taking on a different role in order to open a box and doing things like joint attention. And this is I think this is kind of the epitome, or at least this is a key part of human social intelligence and the kind of thing that we would want to engineer in robotic systems that are going to have social intelligence. But what's important is that, but what's also kind of key is that this all relies on aspects of human general intelligence and kind of understanding human general intelligence at the appropriate level of abstraction. Things like decision making, planning, forming a model of reality, retrieving knowledge and skills, and so on. And so even in the work I was just talking about, you have this rich kind of phase of planning and phase of inference, and there are a lot of details in there that depend on the particulars of how human intelligence is structured. And so a large part of the research that I've been doing more recently is kind of trying to investigate and kind of think about these aspects of human general intelligence at a level of abstraction that is appropriate kind of for thinking about engineering social intelligence and understanding social intelligence in humans more broadly. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this work, kind of thinking about planning in particular, because planning is really kind of the locus of a lot of human general problem solving, if you want to call it that. Our ability to kind of adaptively respond to the world and other people depends on our capacity to flexibly plan. So for example, we're often planning in situations where we have to navigate or, play chess or cook and so on. So lots of tasks, everyday tasks involve people engaging in a process of model-based planning. And so, as I said, planning underpins flexibility, and the kind of classic distinction is between planning and habits, where, if you can imagine driving to work, you drive to work every day, and, but on one day you find out that the road that you typically take to work is closed, you'll have to engage in a process of kind of forming a model of the world, thinking about, oh, if I go down that road, I won't be able to get to work, and then replotting. And so this, again, this is kind of planning is kind of a key part of what makes humans flexible actors. And so, planning is very useful, but it's also very hard. It's very computationally intractable. The kind of key problem with planning is that, as the kind of horizon of planning increases, you run into the problem of the curse of dimensionality, and searching for future actions gets hard very quickly as branching continues. And so the kind of key question for understanding how humans are able to be such general and flexible planners is, how do we do this efficiently? How do we actually organize and access knowledge in a way that's efficient and allows us to plan? And so, in the cognitive science literature, there's a lot of different mechanisms that have been proposed for how people, engage in efficient planning. Things from, not planning at all, basically doing model-free reasoning, doing various state encodings, and so on. And the kind of set of ideas that me and my colleagues have been developing is, maybe people are engaged in a process of kind of flexibly forming representations of tasks that allow them to more efficiently solve them and engage in more efficient planning. And so this idea of representations in planning, we developed it a bit in this work, thinking about kind of how does this relate to the kind of classic model of planning. So in the classic model of planning, you have your representation of a task, you do some kind of planning over that, like tree search, and then you take an action. In our paper from last year, we proposed this idea of value guided construal, which is this idea that you have a task out there in the world, but you're also forming a simplified version of that task, planning over that simplified version of the task, and then taking actions. And so there's actually an adaptive process of both, forming a task representation and doing planning over that representation. And this leads to distinct predictions about how people are solving problems, as I'll kind of go into in a second. But the kind of key idea is to think of this as a kind of resource rational or boundedly rational process where you have a value of what we're calling a construal of a task in relation to a task tau. And that depends on the plan that you get when you use that construal for planning on the task, minus some computational cost of that construal. And in the case of thinking about representational costs, it has to do with the complexity of the cost. So say the number of details that you're paying attention to. And so just to kind of give an intuitive example, you can imagine, riding a bike in some town. And if you're starting in one location and you're trying to get to another location, you might take some route to avoid buildings and get there efficiently. But you wouldn't actually plan in this type of representation of the world. You would form a simpler representation, because even though this very complicated representation, if you even could plan in it, would give you the optimal policy, it's just too detailed. There are too many things going on to actually use it. And so you could use a different representation of the space. You could represent the streets like this, and maybe you'll take this path as a result. But even though this is a simpler representation, includes fewer details, and the cognitive cost is better, this isn't as efficient as the original one. And so what you really want is something more like this, where you're representing the bike paths because you're on a bike, and you plan this type of route. And in this case, both the behavioral utility is good and the cognitive cost is good because it's a simplified representation of the more complicated world. And so, so this is kind of the intuition behind this model, that you're kind of trading off this behavioral utility of using a model for a plan and the cost of that model, of kind of constructing and maintaining that model in mind. And so to kind of summarize, you can have representations that are good in utility and bad in cost, or bad in utility and good in cost. But ideally, you want ones that are both good and in utility and good in cost. And the hypothesis here is that humans, when they're planning, they engage in a process of kind of finding these representations of problems that are both good, have high utility, and low cost. And so, we tested this experimentally in a very simple grid world task where, on the right is the kind of fully detailed version of the task, where you had to kind of navigate to a goal location. And basically, in the same way that you can navigate through this town to get to the goal, you can navigate through the maze to get to the goal. And in the same way that, you can imagine there being an optimal representation for biking, there's an optimal kind of simplified representation in these maze tasks. And so this cognitive model gives us predictions for which object people are going to pay attention to in this type of task and which ones they're going to ignore. And so just very quickly, this is, a set of some of the predictions of this model on some specific mazes, just to give an intuition. And if we look at all the obstacles that were predicted to be ignored by the model and compare that to average responses, we find that people tend to rate those as having less, as paying less attention to them, and conversely, things that are included in the model, people pay attention to more. In that work, the kind of behavior was not strongly affected by this process of construal, this process of kind of forming representations. And so, from a kind of, theory of mind or perspective, maybe it's not so important. But there are actually cases where it actually does make a big difference what the representation people are what kind of representation people are using for a task. And one example of that is this set of ideas from kind of the classic psychology literature called functional fixedness. And so if you haven't seen or heard of this term before, the kind of classic functional fixedness example is this candle task from Dunker in 1945. And in functional fixedness, okay, and so in this task, maybe take a second. So you're given a candle, a book of matches, and a box of tacks. And as the participant, you're told that your goal is to mount the candle on the wall and then light it. And so if you haven't seen this before, maybe take a second to think about it. How would you do it? Maybe simulate how you might interact with these objects. And when you give this to people, they tend to try things like trying to melt the candle to the wall or trying to tack the candle to the wall. And neither of these things work because the candle is made of wax, or it's too heavy to melt to the wall. The solution is actually to take the box, empty it out, and then tack the box to the wall and put the candle in the box and then light the box. A lot of people don't get this answer, but when they're shown this solution, it kind of clicks into place. And one kind of hypothesis about why this is happening is that people are using the wrong task representation to solve the problem. They're kind of stuck in the wrong task representation. And so in this case, they're kind of construing the box as a container for the task and not as a support for the candle. And that tendency to kind of think about it in one way kind of blocks the ability to think about it in the other way. And so this is an example where behavior is actually very strongly affected by the task representation that ends up being used. And so to study this in a more controlled setting, we developed a set of mazes that kind of have a similar flavor. And as kind of motivating example, you can imagine, in an airport, there are many terminals, and you can think of terminals at a very high level of abstraction, or you can kind of zoom in on a particular terminal and think of it in a much lower level of abstraction, think about kind of specific locations and restaurants and stuff. And so we designed a maze, family of mazes that have a similar property to this, where there are a set of blocks that block you, and then also a set of kind of smaller notches in each of the blocks that you can walk through. And this kind of microstructure may or may not be relevant for solving the task. And so, for example, on this maze on the left, you can take the path on the right, but you can come up with that path without actually paying attention to any of the notches. You can do it while only kind of paying attention to the larger blocks and only thinking about how those could block you. But if you imagine moving this block here up, now you can't just solve this problem in terms of only blocks. You actually need to think about at least one of the notches and think about how going through that notch gets you to the goal. And so we designed a relatively simple experiment where we basically trained people on a sequence of mazes in which it was necessary to use a notch to get to the goal. And so it required kind of paying attention to both notches and blocks, reasoning about a problem in a maze in terms of blocks and notches. And then we also gave a separate group of people notch unnecessary mazes where they didn't have to think about the notches, even though they knew about the affordances of notches. And then on a set of test trials, we had mazes where, depending on if you were thinking about things in terms of only blocks or blocks and notches, you would take a different sequence of actions. Basically, if you were only thinking of it in terms of blocks, you would miss this kind of shortcut here to get to the goal. And so when we gave these to people, we found that and so what I'm showing you here is just the proportion of people that discovered this or kind of took this shortcut to get to the goal, indicating that they were paying attention to the notch. And it's broken out by these two training conditions here. And what you can see is that when people were trained on the notch unnecessary trials, they were much less likely to take this short route, even though it was more optimal. And that this actually persisted over the test trials up until even for some people at the last test trial. And so this is a kind of fixedness or a kind of rigidity in how people are solving problems. So yeah, and we have some results about reaction times I can talk about if people are curious later. But the kind of key, I think, relevant thing here for thinking about, interactive social systems and social intelligence is that, we can kind of think about this as resulting from a kind of switch cost where, on a given task, you're not just choosing a construal, but you're kind of biased by, the family of construals that you're currently thinking of. So in one case, you could be thinking of blocks and notches or thinking about only blocks. And there's a kind of stickiness resulting from this switch cost. So yeah, just to kind of summarize some high level thoughts. So I think, we can really think of cognitive science as a source of design principles. And I talked about, a couple of projects trying to make some of these connections, thinking about communicative intent, and importantly, also thinking about how kind of some of the idiosyncrasies of human planning and human general intelligence, how that really, I think, should figure into how we think about designing and understanding social intelligence and interaction, because so much of human social intelligence kind of depends on the particular ways in which we plan and understand the planning of other humans. And I think, there's this kind of more general question of, okay, what is the right level of analysis for drawing on cognitive science and applying them to designing and engineering socially intelligent systems? Should we think about things at a more computational versus algorithmic versus implementational level? And I think it's pretty clear that we probably don't care too much about what's happening at the implementational level, things like, what kind of neurons are firing and so on. But we do care about, at a computational level and algorithmic level, those are going to play a key role. Understanding, how humans solve problems at that level are going to be especially important for designing systems that are going to interact with people and need to help people and cooperate with people. So yeah, just want to thank some of the collaborators on this work that I presented, and thank you all for listening.
All right, thanks so much for Mark. So we have a few minutes for several questions. For in-person audience, you can raise your hand. For online audience, you can raise your hand on chat, raise your hand on Zoom or type your question in the chat.
Should I be calling on people or?
No, so we have one in-person question. You can introduce your name and your question.
Sorry, I can't hear anything.
You maybe take the thing off of the microphone. Yeah, sorry. Can you hear that question? Or
Maybe Adi, you can repeat the question afterwards.
yeah, I'm just gonna
Yeah.
come up to the speaking podium. Right.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the talk. I really like the perspectives you provided. I had a bit of a question about the first part of the talk, where you talked about these value-guided task controls. It seemed like that might be a bit of a circular problem, no? In the sense, in order to get good value functions, you need to kind of do planning. And so how do you resolve this chicken and egg problem where you kind of need to know how to solve the task to know what the representation is?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So yeah, the way I've kind of presented it is at this very abstract level where you're kind of solving this joint optimization problem, and the model, the world model and the plan are kind of, you kind of need both, and they're kind of interdependent, or like, yeah. And so I think so in the work I presented, we kind of did that brute force. We kind of solved the chicken and egg problem by kind of just doing the joint optimization brute force. But you can imagine, and this is something that I'm starting to explore with collaborators, like more efficient algorithms for kind of jointly searching over the space of construals and policies in a smarter way. And so, yeah.
Is the thought that your construals don't need to be perfect; they just need to be good enough to like reduce the space? So that's what.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one way to go about it, kind of thinking of it as more of a satisficing problem. Like all you need to do is just find something that helps you, that has some value above a threshold, for example. And then you don't need to search the full space. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so I think we can maybe still ask one question. Are there any in-person audience?
I don't think, no, not in person.
There's one online.
Right, so Shavi, maybe you can ask yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark, for the great talk. I actually had a related question to the one was last asked. I was wondering if you have thoughts on what are good strategies for sampling the state of construal representations, especially in like more complex domains.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, so I can speculate. I think a lot more work needs to be done to really understand what's going on there. But some ideas that have come up are, we are kind of organized, like humans kind of organize knowledge into like semantic categories, and we're not like kind of solving problems in kind of this full semantic space simultaneously. And so construals are probably also organized semantically. And so, if you're paying attention to a hammer, you're probably also paying attention to a nail, the nail in the environment, and maybe you're also paying attention to, the wood or something like that. And so think like semantics can kind of provide like a initialization or like heuristic for searching for construals. So I think that's one way to start getting at it.